Hello and welcome everyone to this new video on Jackal Productions. Today we're going to take a closer look into the horror of Bloodborne. The horror elements within Bloodborne are obvious. Scary and creepy corridors? Check. Statues of gargoyles and chimeras? Check. Werewolves and other lichens? Check. Spiders, trolls, vampires? They're all there. It is safe to assume that this game is a unique horror survival game. But what makes this game so different? What sets Bloodborne apart from other horror video game titles, the likes of Resident Evil or The Evil Within? It is the fact that the entire design and narrative of Bloodborne contains two different forms or genres of horror: Gothic horror and Cosmic horror. These two different kinds of horror are interconnected within Bloodborne and serve each other in order to express the entire narrative through visual and ludological storytelling. Usually these two forms of horror remain within their own distinctive domains. But in Bloodborne this is fairly different. I mean, first you walk in this Victorian era town called Yharnam, and the next moment you're fighting off slimy slugs. In this video essay we are going to examine the Gothic and Cosmic horror elements of Bloodborne by looking into the narrative and entire design of the game, which we will relate to the writings by, among others, H.P Lovecraft and Bram Stoker. So, let's dive in the horrors of Bloodborne. The narratives and visual design of Bloodborne are very much grounded in the so-called Gothic horror genre. This genre of literature, and later film, emerged at the end of the 1700s and early 1800s. Horace Walpole's 1764 novel The Castle of Otranto, set in a haunted castle from medieval times, is generally regarded as the first Gothic novel. The popularity of extreme romanticism and the sublime brought a vast array of different Gothic horror novels, and the popularity of the genre itself reached an all-time peak in the 19th century with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the works by E.T.A. Hoffmann and Edgar Allan Poe. Bram Stoker's Dracula and Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde also contributed to the popularity of this genre at the end of 1800. As a literary genre, Gothic mixes mystery, romanticism and horror. In the past, the term Gothic was used to refer to the German tribe of the Goths. Unfortunately, this also meant that for a long time, Gothic was associated with this idea of a medieval barbaric lower art form. Luckily this all changed. Around the mid-18th century, within art criticism, more attention was paid to Gothic as a form of architecture. The meaning of Gothic as a medieval art form remained, but without a negative connotation. What is central to Gothic horror is the emotion of fear. The Gothic novel flourished within the pre-Romantic movement and therefore has many characteristics in common with other genres, especially Romantic literature and the ghost story. Similar to the very old genre of the ghost story, Gothic horror also concerns the supernatural. This makes sense, knowing that the Dark Ages provides an excellent backdrop for tales of ghosts. Similar to Romantic literature, the glorification of the sublime, das Erhabene, is an important element within Gothic horror. The term in general refers to a greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement or imitation. The sublime not only refers to physical greatness, but also spiritual and or metaphysical. Edmund Burke's explanation of the sublime is most fitting when thinking about Gothic horror. In his philosophical essay, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful from 1757, Burke argues that darkness, or the things that confuse us or create uncertainty, are able to activate the imagination to apprehension, terror, fright, and a degree of horror. While the sublime and the beautiful remain distinct, both can provide a form of pleasure. Sublimity may evoke horror, but knowledge that the perception is a fiction is pleasurable. This also explains to a certain degree why we enjoy playing, watching, or reading horror. We are able to feel this sense of awe. We are able to feel fear. However, we are also able to zone out of it at any moment we want. The basic theme of the Gothic horror genre is fear, with the obvious intent to make the reader afraid of the terror and dread within the stories. So, let's look into the design and narrative of Bloodborne. The first part of this game is very much grounded in the Gothic horror genre. Think of the design of the world of Yharnam, the Victorian era buildings and the Gothic cathedrals. This is also noticeable by looking at the design of the enemies, vampire-like monsters, werewolves and ghostly apparitions, etc. Take for instance Canehurst Castle. This area and the vampire-like creatures that delve there are obviously inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. You as a player might have a similar experience as those who read Stoker's Dracula for the very first time, the moment when the main characters explore the eerie medieval castle filled with obscure secrets and unnatural demonic forces. The most significant contributor to this Gothic element is the historical story of Yharnam itself. Madeline Hood, a senior lecturer in drama at the University of Huddersfield, also underscores this in her work titled Narrative Design and Authorship in Bloodborne. She argues that Bloodborne relies on one specific motive from the Gothic and the horror, which is its insistence on reliving history to find out what has happened before. This in itself is a recurring narrative strategy in all Soulsborne games. By delving into the past, players are able to decipher its mysterious secrets. Hood argues that the presented game world of Yharnam is the archetypal Gothic setting, built on the remnants of its past. The waves created by historical events resonate within the present of the player as they realize the past through gameplay. Another aspect of this tradition in Bloodborne is what Hood calls Gothic medicine. Now, this is a style of writing in which the medical advancements of the 19th century are connected to the bizarreness of Gothic horror. The stories in Gothic medicine concern physicians, scientists or archaeologists, etc., who discover strange, unfamiliar creatures or things. Out of medical curiosity and a desire for medical advancement, the physician examines these things. Hood explains that the imagery of the mad scientist and doctor within Gothic literature is tied closely together with the language that was employed in scientific text at the time, creating a symbiotic bond between theme and text, fictionalizing the research and bringing legitimacy to the possibility of the plots employed by its writers. Bloodborne is a clear example of this. Just look at the entire storyline of Master Willem and the Bergenworth scholars. While exploring the lecture building, for instance, the fictionalized research connected to Gothic medicine is clearly present. Also the locations and the conducted experiments of the School of Mensis or Lawrence Healing Church are other instances of Gothic medicine. The exploration and examination of the unknown, of the alien, with the aim of gaining new knowledge or power. Such experiments come with a price, and this is something we see in the Old Hunters DLC, which shows both the sorrow and resentment of the victims of these experiments at the hands of the scholars of Bergenworth. During the final part of Bloodborne, players encounter a strange-looking creature called Rom. This creature resembles a caterpillar and a centipede, and doesn't seem to be very hostile. Yet the game forces players to slay this seemingly unharmful being, in order to advance the story. Once Rom is dead, the hunter receives enough insight and is able to access a higher level of perception. It appears that this creature of Rom actually blocked the true reality of Yharnam. Now the hunter is able to see ancient beings, Great Ones, who are influencing the entire world of Yharnam. These Great Ones exist within other planes of existence, and their knowledge is beyond that of humans. The first part of the game presents a somewhat clearly framed Yharnam, in which Gothic horror plays a prominent part. However, during the final part of the game, these Gothic horror elements distort to such a degree that the entire world has become unstable and unfamiliar. New enemies, unfamiliar and alien, enter the world of Bloodborne. Moreover, the worlds themselves become more strange and bizarre. This casts doubt on the reality of Yharnam itself. Does it even really exist? Or is it a nightmarish dimension created by these Great Ones? During this phase of the game, players are confronted with Queen Yharnam, who was the ancient queen of the dead civilization of Pthumeru. The game suggests that Queen Yharnam was impregnated by an invisible Great One. She conceived a stillborn Great One called Murgo. However, Murgo's consciousness survived, and his suffering is actually the cause of the scourge of the beast. Now it's up to the player to enter the realm of this nightmare in order to find Murgo and to put his suffering to rest. The final part of Bloodborne reveals that its story and design aren't merely inspired by Gothic horror, but also by the weird tales and horror fiction of H.P Lovecraft, most notably the Cthulhu mythos. Central to Lovecraftian horror is the idea that humanity is just a tiny cog in a vast and hostile universe. Moreover, this hostile cosmos has no interest in humanity itself. In that sense, Lovecraft's work critique humanocentrism. In this cosmos, fantastic creatures reside, and some of these are enormous in size and on higher planes of existence. Such creatures are called Great Ones and possess inhuman knowledge. It is the idea that most people aren't aware of the existence of such monstrosities, and those who do encounter them in dreams or in dreamlike states. Hood also addresses this by arguing that during the final part of the game, there is a shift from the Gothic to the realms of the weird. It is here that the game moves away from ideas of research and science and into the realms of the weird, showing its in-depthness to the work of H.P. Lovecraft. An interview with Hidetaka Miyazaki by Future Press also confirms this, by addressing the specific function of these forms of horror within Bloodborne. I think that Bloodborne has aspects of both Gothic and Cthulhu style horror, but it's the former that's depicted from the start and provides a guide for the game's visual feel. That's because Gothic horror is based more in the world of reality. Of course, that doesn't mean it's real, it's a world of grotesque, scary horror, and here you have a world that is gradually being eroded away by Cthulhu style horror. With this, it's safe to say that the Gothic horror functions as a sort of entry passage into the horrific world of Bloodborne. As players progress, they come to learn about the Lovecraftian, Cthulhu-style horror, which is the essential nature of the worlds of this game. As I said before, an important premise in Lovecraft's writings is that the experience of everyday reality is only a thin shell around a deeper reality, which is so complex and strange that it is impossible for the human brain to grasp it. Various Great Ones influence our existence. Cthulhu is the most famous of such Great Ones within the literature of H.P. Lovecraft. It's quite obvious that this creature was used as inspiration with regards to the design of the monsters in Bloodborne. The most obvious example are the lesser amygdala. Notice the enormous shape and the tentacles on its head. These imposing Great Ones can be found clinging on specific chapels and cathedrals. And this fits the idea that they are attracted to places of worship. Some of the lesser amygdala are also able to transport players to different realms. In Lovecraftian fiction, strong emphasis is placed on the idea that some people, who are considered as mentally unstable, are able to obtain certain knowledge and insights into the cosmos. This is also a core theme within the narrative and the gameplay mechanics of Bloodborne. By obtaining and using Great One's wisdom, or Madman's knowledge, players receive insight and are able to perceive differences within the game world. Its symbol shows a cracked open humanoid skull with sharp front teeth. Through the skull, a slug-like apparition emerges. There is another gameplay mechanic in Bloodborne that relates to this idea of madness as a result of inhuman knowledge. This mechanic is called frenzy, which is a meter that fills up once players get too close to specific creatures, such as the lesser amygdala or ebrietas. These monsters are considered as Great Ones or have a specific affiliation with them. Once the meter is filled, players will instantly die or lose a significant amount of health. With this in mind, one might argue that this frenzy is actually an example of instant madness caused by the incomprehensible knowledge of the Great Ones. The Lovecraftian theme of madness is also expressed through the various characters in Bloodborne. One of these is Mikolash, host of the Nightmare. This character has attained such a level of inhuman knowledge that he was able to enter a new plane of existence, also known as the Nightmare. However, this was not without a cost, since he lost his own body and sanity. Players actually encounter Mikolash for the first time when he is already dead. When players encounter this character for the first time in the other plane of existence, where his consciousness resides, he starts mumbling about the cosmos and other higher planes. And eventually he sends his minions at you while running and laughing erratically. This character is perfectly in line with the mad figures in Lovecraft's writings. Hood also looks into the Lovecraftian elements within Bloodborne by presenting a distinction between the mundane and otherworldly spaces. She relates this to the differences between the Gothic horror tradition and the Lovecraftian tradition. Hood argues that the Gothic tradition relates to the more mundane worlds, whereas the Lovecraftian tradition relates to the supernatural worlds and spaces. For Hood, the more mundane spaces within Bloodborne are essentially normal, yet they do contain otherworldly elements, such as werewolves or vampires. The location of Central Yharnam is a clear example of this. At this specific location, players are confronted with familiar Victorian-era architecture, and encounter lichen creatures that still resemble humanoid features. The supernatural worlds, on the other hand, are distinctive spaces, not only in terms of the aesthetics, unfamiliar and strange environs, but most importantly because these worlds are physically independent from the mundane worlds. It is interesting to see how a video game makes use of a familiar horror genre, Gothic horror, in order to create an atmospheric and sublime experience. With a sublime experience, as understood by Burke, I mean an experience which gives this sense of awe, a sense of being overwhelmed, while at the same time being aware of the fact that you are still somehow safe. However, this realization changes as the story of Bloodborne progresses. The Yharnam you knew when you started the game becomes something different. New monstrosities, new enemies are lurking in the distance. The sense of familiarity, a form of security, disappears. Players are left to forces they don't really understand. A true sense of uncanniness. Something which appears strangely familiar, yet is somehow a distorted reality. The Hunter's Nightmare is a clear example of this. A location similar to the Cathedral Ward, yet it is distorted to such a degree that this sense of security disappears. Also, when you return to Yharnam and its surroundings after slaying Bram, things have changed to such a degree that fear and confusion arise. What remains is an experience that effectively mimics the madness and terror as described in the works of H.P Lovecraft. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more on Jackal Productions.